This meeting is being recorded.
All right, so I'm gonna mute everyone, and then Jack, you unmute yourself because it's easier than me going through.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask everybody to turn their video off. If you don't turn it off, I will then come around and turn it off, but make it easier for me and please turn your videos off. Okay. Jack, you can turn your video on and also your unmute yourself.
No, I'll just leave it this way. I
Okay.
think I've unmuted.
That's good. I see that. That's good. Okay, very good. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Friday, January 21st meeting. I'm still letting a lot of people in, so if I'm a little distracted, that's why. Our next meeting will be Friday, February 18th. The speaker will be Eric Azustowitz, and Eric always does a killer show with lots and lots of videos, and not that many presenters can do videos well, but he does. The exact topics you will see in the flyer. I want to make some announcement about trips this year. We are planning a convention in San Diego in Southern California, July 7th through 10. Bookings are open, both the ERA bookings as well as the hotel. People are signing up. So if you want to get the discounted hotel room sooner rather than later, we have a full program set up for that. Details again are on erausa.org. The second trip that has just been posted is our trip to Greece. That is also on the erausa.org website. In both cases, you received hard copies about both trips. Mike, what are the deadlines for booking for Greece? And you can unmute yourself. Michael Glicken.
I can't, it's not unmuting.
No, we can hear you.
April 30th.
April 30th, okay. And the other question somebody asked before you came online, obviously we hope all these trips happen, but just consistent with what happened in 2020, in the unlikely event that the country or whatever cancels the trip, we can't do the trip, it would be refundable, I take it.
It would be refundable if we can't do the trip, yes.
Right, okay.
We would bear any advance payment losses in that respect. If the individual decides not to do the trip on their own, there's a 10% penalty that's effective from the time that they book, but no more than that penalty as long as they cancel before April 30th.
Okay, very good.
And
So
it's
John,
all, it's all spelled out, but if we can't do it, we'll do the same thing we did the last time and refund.
All right, John McCowan, who's on here, had asked that question. Since you're the trip organizer, I wanted everybody to hear that.
We have a lot of interest that has been expressed. We have a low minimum for the Greece trip, and based on all of our readings, everyone does have to be vaccinated, and it's apparent that they'll have to be boosted as well. But don't rush to be boosted if they aren't rushing anyway.
Right. Okay. Very good. Thank you very much, Mike. I'm gonna mute you now. Okay. Are there any questions on the only other thing is at the present time, we are going to be continuing Zoom meetings. We have not heard from the hotel. Even if we do book with a hotel, we will continue the Zoom meetings. In our opinion, the Zoom meetings are more important than the in-person meetings because we can have people from Japan, Australia, we don't have anybody from Europe tonight, but we do get European members signing on. And we do like to get as many people as we can. Jack, you're at 134 right now. All right, without any further ado, you came to listen to Jack, not to me. Let me introduce Jack, if he even needs an introduction. Jack is a longtime conventions and trip chairman, former editor of Headlights. He's tonight's presenter. This program is from a trip Jack and the late Phil Craig took to Japan in spring of 2010. Its focus is on visiting cities with traditional streetcar lines, many of which were too small to support heavy rail metro system. But also there are some large cities which retain a number of streetcar lines, mainly as feeders to rapid transit. Of the 18 cities with tramways, Jack and Phil visited 15 on their 3-week sojourn. These tramway systems consist mainly of street running, center and side of the road, reservation, even a certain amount of cross-country interurban private right-of-way. So with that, I'm going to ask Jack to start the show. Jack, take it away.
Okay,
Hello?
I've got to find,
Yes.
Hi, my name is Harry Cochran. I'm calling from LA, California. I'm trying to zoom in on.
Okay, hold on, please. Just hold on a minute. All right, Jack, why don't you share your screen?
okay, and I'm looking for,
The green button, share screen.
yeah, I've got it, and I'm looking for the right, I've
Oh,
got
the
so many
right screen.
windows open here.
Okay,
Oh, that I can't find the rest of the windows.
okay. You probably have multiple windows open, so just find the one with your thumbnails.
Right.
They're all there. You just have
Can
to.
you
go-
see?
No, I
that
don't
right?
see anything yet.
You don't see anything, even though I see my first slide. So let me figure out. Oh, there's show all windows.
Okay,
Okay, there we go.
okay,
And you
okay. Now we
see a
see,
Japanese flag?
right, and now just make it full screen and then you're good.
That's what I will do.
Okay, you're good.
Okay, I've got a short, maybe not that short introduction. Some of
Okay.
it was already said by Bob. Tonight's program is devoted to the streetcar lines of Japan. More specifically, it mostly consists of scanned slides I took in late March and early April of 2010 on a trip with my wife and ERA member Phil Craig and his wife Susan. We traveled the length and breadth of the nation during cherry blossom season, visiting 3 of the 4 islands that constitute Japan, all except Hokkaido, which contains 2 cities with streetcars, Hakodate and Sapporo. This was not my first trip to the land of the rising sun, as Claire and I stopped off there on return flights to the US for short periods in 2005 and 2008 as well. The first in the Tokyo area during April 2005 and the Kyoto, Osaka, Kansai area during a snowy February in 2008. I'm grateful to Noah Kaplan, who scanned some of the slides from these 2 trips for this presentation for me, as well as to the internet for providing me with the ability to zoom this presentation and allowing me to show some maps and photos that would not be otherwise available. I must especially thank ERA member Yuri Mahler for permission to use photos from the site transphoto.ru and to Robert Schwandel's urbanrail.net sites for some of the maps I will show. Some of the photos I'll show are not from the 2010 trip, but instead were taken in Kyoto, Osaka, Tokyo, and Toyohashi on my earlier visits. The ERA ran a trip to Japan in 2014 under the leadership of Mike Litkin and the late John Pappas. Phil was in the group, but sadly suffered a debilitating stroke on board a train near Sendai, which eventually led to his death in December 2016. So this show is dedicated to his memory and his lifetime dedication to the cause of electric public transportation. As most of you probably know from reading my serialized trip reports in the ERA bulletin, I like to travel, especially to visit transit properties in foreign countries. But I'm far from the first of this breed, and one of recognizing the pioneer efforts in such foreign travel by ERA members Frank Goldsmith, the Brown brothers, Jim Buckley, and Ray DeGroot, who I believe is on with us tonight, and others whose footsteps I've tried to follow. Nobody is getting younger, so after COVID fades, I hope to finish my quest to ride the remaining streetcars that I missed on my previous trip to Japan. Mount Fuji, of course, is one of the great symbols of Japan. And I got this picture from a Shinkansen train. Japan is spread over 4 major islands from north to south. Can you see my cursor, by the way? Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku.
We can see your pointer.
Yeah, okay, good. The country has a very dense population, some 127 million, highly concentrated in the cities in its 146,000 square miles. As a great deal of its land consists of mountains, which are not highly populated because of the terrain. Their density of 870 per square mile is almost 10 times our number of 89, based on our population of 331 million scattered over 3.7 million square miles. Thus, Japan is much more crowded than we are, which probably explains why I found the Japanese people to be so polite in all their interactions. There are 2 cities with a population over 10 million, Tokyo with 37.4 million, making it the largest metro area in the world, and Osaka with 19.2 million, the 9th largest. New York comes in at about 10th or 11th. This density and lack of land for wide highways and interchanges has led to a great concentration of rail lines, starting with a busy 3-foot 6-inch gauge conventional system dating from the 19th century and now almost entirely electrified. Capacity ran out on the Tokaido line between Tokyo and Osaka over a half-century ago. So the Japanese built a high-speed railroad, the standard gauge New Tokaido line, which opened in 1964 and now has spread its tentacles all over the country. Called the Shinkansen, the 200-mile-per-hour line is nearing capacity, and now a maglev line is under construction between the 2 largest cities, with planned speeds of over 300 miles per hour. The national railway system has been privatized into 7 pieces, collectively known as the JR Group. With regard to rail, the JR is sometimes referred to as Japan's first sector, with a highly successful group of privately owned electric interurban lines being the second sector. Most of these started in a manner similar to our interurbans, but instead of being abandoned like ours, most have evolved into portions of money-making conglomerates, with many upgraded into modern multi-track electric railway systems with state-of-the-art equipment providing fast and reliable service for the public. One could spend a lifetime covering these lines, but tonight we will concentrate on a part of the 3rd sector, rail lines fully or partly owned by municipal and other local governments. In many of Japan's larger cities, these consist of subways or heavy rapid transit lines, but also gadget bonds like monorails. However, we will be looking at traditional streetcar systems, which have been retained in smaller cities and also continue service to a small extent in some of the larger ones. Yes, just as in North America, many cities opted to convert their electric tram lines to bus operations, whether building subways or not. But some of Japan's population is lucky that their urban and suburban streetcar lines still remain in service. Because not all railways can be fitted into specific categories, as their infrastructure and operational characteristics are really a continuum. Most observers consider there are between 16 and 18 undertakings that can be classified as streetcars or light rail. These are marked red in this map from Mr. Schwandel's urban net. It seems to me that those defined in that manner have one thing in common: onboard fare collection, which in Japan usually consists of passengers depositing the exact fare in coins into fare boxes under the eyes of the driver or operator, or showing or tapping multi-ride electronic or magnetic fare cards. This is usually performed when leaving the vehicle, what we call PAYL, or pay as you leave. There are change-making machines aboard the cars, allowing passengers to have the coins or fare cards ready for a swift exit. Some lines have zone fares, and I'll let those who are interested research how that is handled. I'll just say very cleverly. So on to the slides. Claire and I had arrived in Tokyo a couple of days before the Craigs, which allowed us a little time to make some side trips. We all stayed at the brand new Villa Fontaine Hotel in the Shiodome urban development area near JR Shimbashi Station, which were formerly rail yards, just like New York City's Hudson Yards. Room 8032 had a great view of the Shinkansen and the conventional JR narrow gauge railroad, as well as the so-called new transit line, the Yurakamone. Now, I have no idea whether my pronunciation for this line or any of the other lines later in the program is correct, but we'll have to live with it. Note the duckbill 700 series Shinkansen train and a new transit train just peeking out in the left foreground. Our first side trip was a circle trip of some 35 miles each way to Enoshima and Kamakura to see the Great Buddha and ride over a complex routing that covered a couple of gadget bonds, interurban lines, and the JR. We rode the automated rubber-tired Yurakamone line through new developments on artificial islands in Tokyo Harbor. The station platforms are all enclosed with elevator doors, which were virtually impossible to photograph through, but we were able to obtain the ersatz motorman seat on this automated line for both viewing and taking photos. The line opened in 1995. We transferred to the Toden Yurakucho subway line in Shinkiba Station. We changed again after the line emerged through a portal into hazy sunlight. Most of the day, though, was overcast. These cars were built by Hitachi in 2006. We changed to the third sector Rinkai interurban line, which took us through the Tokyo monorail at Tanozu Isle Station. The monorail connects the city with the second airport, Haneda. As you can see, it is of the Alvag straddling type, similar to what began operating in Seattle in 1962. This one was built in 1964 for the Olympics, and this view is from one of the intermediate stations, Ryutu. It's not particularly fast, there's not much room for luggage, but it was busy with standees, mostly local riders. 3 separate stopping patterns are operated, accommodating both airport passengers with express service and the local riders. Time was a wasting because of my obsession with stopping for photos. So before we reached Yokohama via the Kihin Kikyu interurban from Haneda, our 5th line of the day, we decided to forego other interurbans and ride JR directly to the Kamakura area. This map shows the Enoshima Electric Railway in red and the Shonan monorail in purple. We actually got off at Kitamukura Station and walked to the terminal through a shrine with beautiful gardens, cherry blossoms, and intriguing statuary. Like the JR lines, the Enoden, which is what the Enoshima Electric Railway is called, has a 3-foot 6-inch gauge. It's 6 miles long with 15 stops and is mainly single track with passing rails at many stations. With some street running, but having a closed system with station fare collection, it can be considered a cross between a streetcar and an interurban. Both cars, 1501 and 1001, were built by the Tokyo Car Company in 1979 and 1980. The next two photos were taken near the Hase station, the location of the Great Buddha. Because the heritage movement had a late start in Japan, as many companies converted early equipment to scrap to aid the war effort, many railways have built replicas, albeit not very accurate ones, but with modern electric equipment. Number 50 was built in 1997 to reflect the 1902 origin of the Enoden. Here is the 44-foot tall Great Buddha of Kamakura, a major traffic generator for the line. On the Shogensi temple grounds, the Buddha was first built of wood in 1252, but having been damaged by storms, it was later reconstructed in bronze. We didn't have time to ride the Shonan monorail on this trip, but rode it in 2005. Built in 1970 and 71, it's 4 miles long and has 8 stations. These are photos of the monorail from the internet. As you can see, it's suspended or hanging and was built under rights from Safej, a French Renault Michelin undertaking. These cars were constructed in 2004. We returned on JR from the Fujisawa station rather than our original plan to use the Odakyu interurban line. Our other circle trip, this time with Phil and Sue, did involve the Odakyu, my favorite interurban. It was the popular Hakone Circle Scenic Loop, involving 5 modes of transportation and starting from Odawara, some 50 miles southwest of Tokyo. In addition to being reachable by the Odakyu, it can be accessed by both JR conventional and high-speed trains. The Shinkansen takes just over a half hour, with the others varying from an hour to 90 minutes. There we transferred to a train of the Hakone Tozan Railway. The Odakyu has a 3-foot 6-inch gauge and runs under 1500 volts DC, while the Hakone Tozan is standard gauge with 750 volt overhead. They're now under the same ownership. There used to be dual gauge operation between Odawara and the Hakone Tozan's first station, Yumoto, but now only standard gauge trains run there, and all Odakyu trains terminate at Odawara. However, there is still some dual gauge track leading to the car house and shop, as illustrated here. The Odakyu tracks are on the left, and the standard gauge Hakone Tozan are on the right, and you can see a little bit of the dual gauge here. This was the section of dual gauge operation, and I hope you see my cursor. Here at Gora is the connecting funicular, followed by a 2-section ropeway or cable line. Then riders changed to a boat to sail Lake Ashi, followed by one of several bus lines, and these are in blue, back to a railhead. We used a free pass to make the journey. It's free only in the sense that it allows unlimited travel for the time period. In our case, a 1-day pass came in at $50 each. Hakone Tozan number 104 at Yumoto Station. Each series on the HT's roster has been given a name, and the 1000s, which I'm not showing, are called Bernina, after the Rädersebahn in Switzerland, which it would like to emulate, as its line has an has 8% grades and 2 switchbacks through its rugged territory. The 2000s are named St. Moritz. The mostly single track line here in Japan is 9.3 miles long with 11 stations. The newest cars built in 2014 and thus yet unseen in the flesh by me are called Allegras. This photo is from the railway's website. The Kawasaki's do look a little like standard gauge versions of Reda Shaban cars. Here is the funicular, and you can see the cable at Gora, which we rode next. There was a long line to board, but we were patient. The counterbalance trains run for about 3/4 of a mile up a 20% grade to the peak. Here's a photo from the internet of the current equipment, which was delivered in 2020, a mere 2 years ago. Then we transferred to the ropeway or cable line to ride from Saunjan to Togandai, which involved changing from one gondola to another about halfway down. The two segments are 9/10 of a mile and 1.6 miles long, and the ride takes a half hour. The Japanese call these cable operations ropeways. Now for the fleet of sightseeing boats on Lake Ashi, which run from the foot of the ropeway to 2 terminals, thereby accessing a wide variety of trails and bus lines. They are called pirate ships for obvious reasons. One of the features touted in brochures for the circle trip is the opportunity to see Mount Fuji, but we couldn't because of low clouds and rain. This one in this view is named the Vasa after a Swedish ship launched in 1628 that sunk on its first voyage. It was salvaged in 1961 and is the main feature of a museum located on the number 7 streetcar line in Stockholm. But I guess the riding public in Japan doesn't know about the Vasa's history. The voyage took about a half hour, and this photo was taken from our boat, passing a boat going in the other direction. We returned on the Odakyu after a bus ride to a Hakone Tozan way station and Odawara by train. I made reservations for the front row seats in the observation deck of the 16:47 p.m. romance train well in advance by email. As a result, we were able to photograph oncoming trains after paying the extra fare, about double the price of riding in a regular express. Our seats could be swiveled, but why do that when we were entertained by the procession of outbound trains in the weekday rush hour? These trains also run on the Odakyu's Enoshima line. This was our 50,000 series train, the 7th iteration of the concept that came out in 2005 and has now been superseded by 2 newer models. The 7000 series from 1980 was still operating in 2010, but the last of them were withdrawn in 2018. These trains run to Shinjuku Station in Tokyo, which is the Odakyu's headquarters. Other more traditional ones provide single-seat service through Tokyo Metro's Chiyoda line with a crew change. And this was a photo taken at the front window of our romance or observation train. Now to some real streetcars. The only remaining car line of the once vast Tokyo streetcar network is the Arakawa line, which was created in 1974 by combining 2 outlying routes that mainly operated on private right-of-way. And here you can see that in green right over here. The 7.5 mile long, 30-stop route intersects and therefore feeds or is fed by many subway and commuter lines. Good connections are made with 4 subway lines and 4 suburban routes. In 2005, 2 street running sections remain, down to 1 in 2010, and I suspect that is still the same. At least it is according to Google Earth. There are no stops on the busy street, which is right up here where the street running portion runs. high-level platforms, so no low-floor cars are needed for this service. It's also pay-as-you-leave fare collection, and the gauge is 4 feet 6 inches. Phil and I stumbled on an open house at the museum next door to the line's car house. With a wide open gate, plenty of folks were around. Museum pieces included number 5501, Tokyo's only PCC car. The 1954 built vehicle is equipped with standard foot controls, and the interior contains a great many historic photos. Sumitomo supplied the B3 trucks under a Transit Research Corporation license for PCC patents. Apparently, Toten's management decided that such a fleet would be too expensive, but this single car did run in Tokyo for 13 years. You saw 7504 in the first slide of the museum. The 7500, some 20 cars built in 1962, were in the process of being retired in favor of newer equipment back in 2010. Most service was being provided by the older 1955 built 7000 series, of which there were 31 that were renovated in 1977. Number 7026 at one of the major transfer locations, OG in the Kita area of Tokyo, where connections are made to the Chihin Tohoku line above and the Nambuko subway line before. You can see the tracks above. This is where the remaining street running section begins. The same location with number 8504, one of 5 cars built in 1990. I should mention that the number of cars in each series is relatively small. With excellent maintenance standards, there is little reason to order huge fleet replacements on any of Japan's streetcar systems. Number 8804 near the car house. It was one of 10 of the line's newest units at the time. Another view of these 4 actual cars on the southern end of the line, where the right-of-way is mostly back alley-like. Number 8903 and a view from Yuri Maller's site. 8 of these were built between 2015 and 2017, and I suspect that more of these modern units will be coming. Note the same narrow back alley right-of-way. And of course, the Arakawa line has to have its own replicas to bring back memories of early streetcar days in Tokyo. 2 of these obvious imitations were built in 2007, and they too are equipped with modern controls and modern electrical equipment. Back to OG with a suburban EMU train running above. All in all, the Arakawa is a very modern operation with no large articulated cars, but short headways. Now on to the Setagaya line, Tokyo's other streetcar operation, which Phil and I visited that afternoon. It does not go into the heart of the city either. In fact, it's more of a suburban streetcar line like Red Arrow outside of Philadelphia or the Alvik Nakabe line in Stockholm. It's also 4-foot 6-inch gauge. Built in 1925 and owned by the Tokyo Car Company, which has quite a few interurban lines in its portfolio. The 3.1-mile line has 10 articulated Tokyo-built cars that operate through 10 stops entirely on PRW. The 1999 built cars are all painted in different attractive colors. To reach the Setagaya, we had to ride 2 stops from Shibuya Station to Sanganjaya, and suddenly thought we were in a prosperous version of Cleveland. There certainly is a resemblance between Tokyo's cars running on the RTA's Red Line and these 8500 series units on Tokyo's Denentashi line. There are 230 of these built between 1975 and 1991. Cleveland's are from 1985. Now to the provinces and Toyama, a city of 420,000, lying some 250 miles northeast of the capital. In 2010, we could only take the Shinkansen part of the way to Ashigo to Zawa, and the trip took 3¼ hours. Now it's only 2½ on through high-speed trains, which were extended in 2015. In 2010, the city hosted 2 systems, each operating on either side of the railroad station. The railroad is in gray, and this was one system, Portran, and this was the old city system, Centram. 2 years ago, they were combined with the extension of streetcar tracks under the station. Here's the link, and I'm trying to point to it right here, running under the railroad. And here's the single track loop. And this is the single track portion of it right here through downtown that only has operation in the counterclockwise direction. That's the Jinzu River. And note the end of Route 2 at Daigaku-ma. It will be mentioned again later. There's also an interurban line, and that's this gray line here, serving the endpoint of Route 1 here and the railroad station here. All the lines are owned and operated by the Toyama Chiho Railway, which is known locally as the Chitetsu. Base service in 2010 on the 3-line, 3-foot, 6-inch gauge city system was provided mainly by 7000 series traditional cars dating from 1965, originally 23 in number, but now reduced to 12 because of the addition of new equipment in the last 11 years since our visit. This is the Chitetsu's older color scheme. We had horrendous weather on the day we came up from Tokyo. We left the ladies there and met up with them a night later at our next hotel in Osaka. Note the umbrella. Also note the lines paved right of way, typical of the system trying to keep motorists off the track. At the railroad station, we transitioned to the 8000 series, built in the 1980s. This photo was taken the following morning before our journey to Takaoka and Fukui, and then on to Osaka. The weather had miraculously become sunny and warm after the rain and snow of the previous day. The change in our luck delayed our departure for about an hour for obvious reasons. Another view the following morning. This is the Minami terminal of the main line, where connections are made to the Chitetsu's interurban. 3 articulated low-floor cars in the 9000 series were purchased by the undertaking in 2009 from Nagata, manufactured under license from Bombardier. And you can see the contrast between the 2 cars here. Spring was certainly not here yet. It was freezing cold on the previous day in the beginning of April. Note the Centram lettering, probably the first time that name for the system was used. Azumi Castle is featured in this view along the single track counterclockwise loop. You'll see more castles later in the program, as almost every city seems to have one. The other system in Toyama, Portram, was originally a Japanese National Railway branch line, first electrified with 600 volt DC overhead, then upgraded to 1500 volts. With patronage low, probably because of poor service and poor frequency, it was decided to convert the line to light rail and back to 600 volts, much like what was done with the Highland branch of the Boston and Albany into today's MBTA D Riverside line, with the same result, success. The terminal was moved to outside the railroad station, with new trackage built through the streets connecting to the suburban line. Placed in service in 2006, patronage immediately soared. According to Wikipedia, ridership started out with almost 10 times the number of passengers that the railroad branch line carried. This was the temporary terminal of the line before it was finally linked up to Centram in 2020. The rear of one of the 7 low-floor cars built for the line in 2006, leaving the street trackage and entering the temporary terminal. They are virtually identical to the TR0600 cars built for Centram. Port Tram is mostly single track. Note the packed snow below the motorman's position. The weather was awful, snow alternating with sleet. A tram approaches the Iwashima outer terminal. And now the terminal itself. Another example of the weather while photographing on the street. And the next morning, perfect sun, but the need to keep to schedule prevented us from retaking previous photos. Here from Yuri Maller's website is a slide showing one of the 4 Little Dancer low-floor cars acquired between 2010 and 2017 from a different car builder, Alna Sharyo. Note that the photo shows the connecting track between Port Tram and Centram under the railway station. Takaoka, with a population of 170,000, lies only 12 miles away from Toyama. The single 8-mile-long, 3-foot 6-inch gauge streetcar line once ran all the way to Toyama as an extension of Line 2 that now terminates at Daigaku in Toyama. It now terminates at a ferry where there used to be an interurban bridge that was destroyed in 1980 when the lagoon's harbor was widened for water traffic. Oshinokata Terminal in the middle of nowhere, but adjacent to the ferry strip. The system's rolling stock from Nagata is virtually identical to Toyama's, but was constructed starting in 2004. An LRV crosses the Sho River. The line sports a combination of double and single track street running, depending how wide the street is. Note the barber pole. There are also a few 1967 built conventional 7000 series cars on the roster, all in advertising liveries, at least in 2010. Do things really go better with Coke? Streetcars do. The car house is about halfway up the line. And note the snowplow. Here's a view on one of the sections of private right-of-way of one of the traditional cars in advertising. And here, the double track turns into some single track private right-of-way. And another view approaching the city center and the terminal of the railroad station. Things go better with Coke in Fukui as well. In fact, seeing all this, could you get me a Coke?
Yes.
Thank you. My voice is getting. Fukui is a city of 270,000, some 75 miles further down the JR tracks. Here's an articulated car on the railway station spur. The 880 series cars, which were built in 1980, came from the city of Gifu when it abandoned its streetcar system on April 1st, 2005, just a few days before my first visit to Japan. The Fukui system has a 3-foot 6-inch gauge and extends for a little less than 14 miles. This map shows the north-south line with its spur to the railroad station. My scan did not pick up the interurban line that runs from the station that is joined by the north, and it runs like where my cursor is going. Let me do it again. From here up to here with branches going out in several directions. but this line runs from the railroad station up to this point, 4 stops on the main line of the streetcar. But now only some trams and the streetcars were extended over the interurban line for 6 more stops, but only some trams make that connection. And that connection had not yet been made in 2010 when Phil and I were there. It is odd that the connection between the station spur from the main line runs from east to north when the preponderance of the line and traffic is to the south. You can see that most of the line runs from down this way, and very little of it was running up this way. Through cars using the spur, because not all cars go to the railroad station, but those that do have to reverse ends at this point. The partly low floor 800 series cars pictured were built in 2000 by Nippon Sharyo. A 700 series car also from Gifu on the PRW line to the south. It was built in 1987. A 200 series articulated car from 1962, scrapped sometime in the past 10 years since our visit. It is shown running under a shed that protects special work from snowy weather, which is quite prevalent in the area. These sheds seem to be located over every switch on the private right-of-way. The 3-track Echizen Tifa terminal on the south end with a 600 and 2 much more modern looking cars. Handsome, but not very modern looking. I don't know anything about number 610 other than it was built by Nippon Sharyo in 1971 and has now been scrapped. Finally, 4 new LRVs from Nagata were delivered to the property between 2013 and 2016. This photo is one of them from Yuri's site. Okay, we're at the end of part 1. I have to switch over to part 2. Okay, now for Kyoto.
Jack, there was a question from Peter Strauss. He said he was intrigued by the amount of English language signage. He was wondering if English proficiency is common these days, and there's a bunch of people who've been to Japan. So Mark Kavanaugh's on.
Let me answer that. In my opinion, English is not proficient in Japan, and most of the people do not know English. However, the Japanese love American culture, and there is so much of it. You'll pick up a brochure about something, the cover will be all in English, but when you open it up to find out what you are wanting to read, it's all in Japanese. So all of the rail systems have maps and fare information in both English and Japanese, but I wouldn't say that the Japanese people are proficient in English.
Yeah,
I don't know if Mark agrees with that or not.
I will say in 2014, the computer software and the computer generated announcements, they have a fair amount of English. So the computers are smart, even if the people aren't proficient.
Anyway, we visited Kyoto from our lodgings in Shinosaka near the Shinkansen station. There are 2 operations of interest in this city of religious and cultural heritage of 1.5 million.
Yeah.
One is a real streetcar line, the Arashiyama or Randen, which we didn't visit in 2010, but I covered it in February 2008. And this is in green on the map. The standard gauge operation is 7 miles long with 4.5 on its 13-stop double track main line and 2.5 on its 8-stop branch. The system is operated by the Keifuku Electric Railway and runs in the western portion of the city and was always independent from the city's municipal streetcar system. That system closed in 1978, and one of its cars was imported into the US for museum operations in Tucson. Number 869 is at the Old Pueblo Museum. The Arashiyama terminal, covered to protect passengers from the elements, with one of the 14 600 series cars built from 1992 to 1995. Note the high platforms on this pay-as-you-leave operation, quite similar to Tokyo. This is a busy stop, which is also near an interurban line in an area that contains 3 shrines. Car 623 on double track in the street at the eastern end of the main line. A similar car on the single track branch, which is entirely on PRW. Number 27, shown on the branch, is one of Ramden's true replicas, which were built in 1994. Snow began to fall. It was February after all. Number 103 was built in 1929, but has been rebuilt and renovated several times. This is the inner terminal at Omaya, where there is a connection with the underground portion of the Hankyu Railway interurban system that runs into Kyoto city center from the cities of Osaka and Kobe. Once that happened, I hopped on the Tozai subway line, one of 2 in Kyoto, to get over to the east side of town and the Keihan Electric at Hamamatsu Station. Both Kyoto subway lines have reciprocal running with interurban lines, but the Tozai Tozai/Keihan connection is most interesting, as its subway cars run on the street in Atsu. The company's standard interurban cars also use street trackage, with both lines connecting at the Hamamatsu station. That's not snow on your TV set, by the way. Bill and I went out this way in 2010. Okay, here is the first line we saw. Then I transferred to the subway after it began snowing here. The subway runs through with the interurban line to Hamamatsu, which is over here. Phil and I went out this way in 2010, and this was our route, continuing up from Hamamatsu to Sakamoto, which is way up here, and then circling back to Kyoto by a funicular, a bus, a cable car, another funicular, and finally another pair of interurban lines take us back to the center of the city. First, another snow shot from 2008. The Keihan is like most interurbans, with high-level platforms and station fare collection employing turnstiles. I don't know when the 600s were built. I do know that 10 pairs of newer 700s were manufactured in 1992 and 1993. Here is a train of 800 850 series subway cars entering the terminal. Oh, wait, that's okay, that's the view. There aren't any stations on the street running part of the line. This slide is from our 2010 circle journey, and here is the joint station in Hamamatsu, where access to the trains is from the second floor and where the fare controls are, and that's where the fare controls are located. We took several photos from the walkway leading to the turnstiles. Another view of the street running, which reminds me of the former operation of Buenos Aires subway line A, where trains ran on the street to reach the storage yard and shop. Note the traffic here. Here's an interurban about to enter the station. Don't forget, it's left side operation in Japan, and the railways and, of course, motor traffic use left-hand running. I guess this is a lucky shot, as it shows a subway train using the interurban line tracks to get to the shops. Conceptually, I guess it's no different from Cleveland's Red Line and the Shaker Heights lines operating over the same rails. The funicular from Sakamoto to Mount Hee, whose terminal is quite a walk from the interurban station. The 2-mile run has 2 intermediate stations and a tunnel. Lake Biwa is in the background on this cloudy, hazy day. Wasn't good weather for a scenic trip. Rather than walking up a long, steep hill to the summit of the Eisen ropeway, we rode a bus for the start of our return trip on the other side of the mountain. So here we are coming up from Hamamatsu, and then, to here, to this point in red. And then we rode the rack railway up to here, and then to get up to this point for the cable line, we could have walked it, but it was a steep hill and there were buses running along the road. The drop is about 3/10 of a mile on the ropeways counterbalance cable cars. The view would have been much better on a sunny day. This time we walked up the hill to get to the Eisen funicular for the 8/10 of a mile run with a 1/3 mile drop. Interestingly, these 2 lines were originally owned by the Keifuku, which owns the Arashiyama line we saw before, but it now belongs to the Keihan. The Keihan's Eiden Interurbans terminal is at the foot of the funicular, and it carried us back to civilization. We took a stop over along the Eiden for a photo of a newer train, and another stopover. From there, we rode to Kyoto's main line railway station and walked to the Umakoji Steam Railway Museum, a longer distance than we expected. Unfortunately, we were too late for a ride on a steam-powered excursion train. The museum's fan-shaped 1952 built roundhouse is spectacular, with as many as 15 or 20 locomotives. I didn't count them. There had been an old Kyoto tram operating at the site, but all we found was rusty track and a building that perhaps still houses it. On the next day, we visited Meiji Mura, an open-air museum in Inayuma that features architecture from the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912. We had to ride the Shinkansen, a Meitetsu interurban, and a Meitetsu bus to get there, and it took 2.5 hours. The weather again was not nice, cloudy with occasional showers. There are lots of interesting buildings on the ground, but we had a different agenda, as you can see from the Trailblazer. Their roster consists of 2 deck roof cars built in 1912 for Kyoto. Number 1 was being displayed without its truck, but here, number 2 was running through the wooded grounds of the open air museum. They are not replicas, but could be considered in that category if you're being very technical, as they were built by the Japanese based on the 1895 drill plans. The single track line is quite attractive and overlooks Lake Iruka. This is my photo, but I prefer this one from Wikipedia, photographed by someone named Barriston. Beautiful line. Here's a photo of number 1. The park closed later in 2010 for major repairs. So we were lucky we were able to see it in that year, but now it has since opened. A heritage bus is also operated, which took us to the park's steam railway, where we got inside a coach for a ride just before the skies opened. The 3-foot 6-inch gauge line has 2 steam locomotives. Number 9 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia in 1912. Here's a close-up of the builder's plate. We then rode to Osaka to sample the Hankai streetcar system. Except for this late afternoon photo at the Tennoji terminal, one of 2 that connects the routes to different subway lines, the remainder of these slides are from my 2008 trip. Note how the terminal is in the center of the street. It's connected to the rest of the world by an overpass. Here's a map. There are 2 terminals, as you can see here, on the 2-line, 12-mile-long system that runs southwest under 600-volt DC overhead from the Osaka subway system. Osaka's municipal streetcar system was closed back in 1969, but this privately owned standard gauge operation has survived into the present. The line from Ebisucho runs as a shuttle to the through line from Tennoji. The system has a fine collection of rolling stock, which consists mostly of double-ended Peter Witt-style cars of different ages running on double track through city streets and on private rights of way. Number 168 was built in 1927 and is painted in the same color scheme as number 247, which operates in museum service over the high-level bridge in Edmonton, Alberta. I suspect number 151, a similar car, which was donated to the Market Street Railway to become part of their vintage fleet, will emerge from the San Francisco shops in the same livery. This view of number 164, a similar car to 168, was taken from the rear of the low-level platform. Note the back alley style right-of-way on the northern part of the line. Further south, number 162 runs in center reservation. Number 711 was built in 1995 by Tokyo Car. I'm surprised that's not an advertising car for the company of the same name. This is a photo of car 705 from 1990 crossing the Yamato River. Number 607, built in 1998, is shown coming off the Tennoji line at Taisha. And here you can see this is where the 2 lines meet. Car 605 is on street trackage right after it left the Tennoji terminal. The 501 was built in 1957 and is shown heading for the Hankai Tennoji's terminal. Note the operator's 10-year before COVID face mask. Car 503 back at Tennoji. Now for Toyohashi, a city with a population of 400,000, which I visited in 2008. The city is 125 miles east of Kyoto and can be reached in less than 1.5 hours by Shinkansen. The Toyohashi Railroad operates a single 3.5-mile, 3-foot 6-gauge line with 14 stops running east from the railroad station. Number 3205 was built in 1955 and came from the tramway in Gifu when it was closed down in 2005. Here is traditional car 3202 at the same location, heading for the station. Number 787 also came from Gifu, but was built much later in 1987. A view of 60 sister car 786 from a downtown pedestrian overpass. And 3202 again from the same location. I love the mountains that you can see in Japan and many cities when you're up in pedestrian overpasses. The far end of the system ends or terminates with two branches. Because they are single tracks, the majority of cars are turned back here at a siding at the Keirinjomai station, the end of double track. The car house was quiet, but an elderly attendant who spoke no English had me sign a visitor's book with entries by rail fans from all over the world, and then signaled to me that I could go out into the yard to take photos. So-called light rail vehicle number 801 came from Gifu in 2005. Apparently it was not a success and was somewhat hidden away. It's a partial low floor car, but there are other units on the roster to photograph here as well. Here's number 3502, which was built in 1956 and ran in Tokyo before being acquired by Toyohashi. And number 3102, a wartime car that came from Nagoya and was built in 1943. Considering its location, it wasn't clear how often it gets on the road, but in my opinion, it's much better than a replica. Give me a moment to take a drink.
You want a cookie or anything?
Now back to our 2010 trip and one of the major highlights, a visit to Hiroshima. This is a view just outside the railway station. Hiroshima, with a population of 1.3 million, is built on a number of islands in a delta where the Ota River runs into the inland sea. It contains Japan's largest streetcar system, the Hiroden, with 8 lines, one a long suburban route that is truly a modern light rail line. There are 20 miles of route and almost 300 cars of various models on the roster, including these modern LRVs. As we all know, Hiroshima was ground zero for the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare on August 6, 1945. This is the A-bomb dome, called the Industrial Promotional Dome when it was still intact, and is the centerpiece of the Peace Memorial Park, now a major tourist attraction. It stands without renovation or restoration near a museum that tries to explain the impact of the bomb on the citizens of the city. A not-to-scale map of the streetcar system. The railroad station is here in the upper right. The line to the port is at the lower right, while the suburban line is in the lower left. The Peace Park is around here, near the left end of the main street. A monorail called Astram is depicted by the dashed line through here. Notice that the JR line runs out and very parallel to the suburban line of the tramway company. Let's start with views of the urban portion of the system, which is almost entirely street running, but separated from motor traffic, emphasizing the different models on the roster. Car 702 is on Route 3. Number 704, built in 1982, is shown in Hiroden's official livery. The 811, also a 4-axle unit in a Peterwitt configuration, probably was built in 1983. Car 906 on the less frequent number 7 line. The 900 series was built in 1957 for Osaka and came to Hiroshima in 1969, right after the municipal streetcar system in Japan's second city was abandoned. Number 911, the brown color scheme, was probably the one used in Osaka, but I really don't know that for sure. Car 1914 came from Kyoto, and this series still retains the color scheme used on its municipal lines. It was built in 1957. Now to the longer cars, mainly built for service on suburban Route 2. The 8 articulated units, these 8 articulated units were called greenliners when they arrived around 1987, probably because the environmental movement is very strong in Hiroshima. The 3800s were followed by 8 3900s in 1990, also called greenliners. Number 3951 is part of another follow-up order of 6 greenliners. These 1997 built units were the last high floor articulateds to be added to the roster. Number 5003 represents the first series of low floor articulated units. Christened green movers. The 12 cars are Siemens Combinos, built in 1999. We all know about the structural problems that the Combino cars had, and so this order was not repeated. After much planning and design work, the 5100s came in 2005 from Kinki Sharyo and received the appellation Green Mover Max. Now on to the suburban line, the 10-mile-long Route 2, which itself covers half the length of the entire streetcar system. Running to the southwest, it operates through Miyajima-guchi across the Yamaseto Strait from Hiroshima Bay, from the island of Itsukushima, or Miyajima, which translates to Shrine Island. This is a beautiful mountainous retreat, virtually free of motor traffic, noted for the tame deer wandering its streets and paths, and the beautiful Itsukushima Gate, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The island is connected by ferry to the light rail line. The line was built as a typical high platform interurban by the local transit company with its own standalone terminal in 1921, but in 1962 was integrated into the streetcar network. Its inner terminal, Hirodanishi, still stands, reconfigured with tracks running through it instead of stub ending. Here is Greenliner 3801 making its stop in the station, which is adjacent to the interurban's old car house and is a short walk from a JR station on its Sanyo line. The JR Sanyo line runs parallel to the former interurban and has its own station and ferry service to the island at Miyajima-guchi. The EMU trains make much fewer stops and therefore constitute a much faster way to travel to the island, but they don't have the distribution through the city center or the local ridership that the streetcars do. Combino Green Mover 5010 was photographed from a pedestrian overpass. A JR train on the 3-foot 6-inch Sanyo route. In a few places like this, the rights of way of the two lines are right alongside each other. You'd think that they were a 4-track railroad. The high-speed Shinkansen also runs parallel, as close as a mile or two in some spots. There are lots of inlets and rivers along the route, and therefore a great many bridges. The crossing of the Iwata River is a very photogenic place. Here is a JR train with Route 2's light rail right-of-way in the foreground. Siemens Combino 5008 at the same spot. I took a lot of pictures here. Here, number 5009 passes Green Mover Max 5101. I love the reflection. And Green Liner 3956. Green Liner 3908 is shown at Kusatsu Minami. Note the high-level platform left over from before the line's conversion to light rail. This platform is no longer used. Combino 511 at the same location. Here, Green Liner 3956 is shown on a part of the right-of-way that is typical of the interurban character of the route. Green Mover Max 5101 at the same spot. Here's a shot of Combino 5009 that I really liked. And one of Green Liner 3901 at an inlet. Ferry service to Miyajimi is provided by two competing lines. The railroads and the traction companies. Tame deer wander throughout the streets of the island. The Tsukushima Gate is usually surrounded by water, but the tide was out, allowing people such as me to approach it. And it really is beautiful. Now back to downtown for a few more photos. The pedestrian overpass behind Green Mover Max 5101 is a quality location for rail fans. Despite the separation from motor traffic, we found the operation in the urban area to be rather slow, especially when compared to the speeds on the suburban section. Here's number 814. And car 1915, a Kyoto unit from the overpass. The 912 is shown at the end of Route 7 and 8 at the JR Yokogawa station. Green Mover Max 5102 operating on the route to the port. Note the grass right of way and the highway that brings trucks to the harbor. Number 707 in the same area. And the last look at one of the ex-Kyoto cars. According to Yuri Maller's website, the Hirudan has added 6 new LRVs to its roster. The 5200 series is called the Green Mover Apex and was introduced to Route 2 in March 2019. This photo is from japanstation.com. The Astra monorail is a new transit line built in 1994, running northward from downtown for 11.5 miles. The manually operated line has 22 stations with an underground section at the city center end. I don't know why it's called a monorail, as it looks like there's a concrete guideway for rubber tires on both sides of the track. Changing to part 3. Now we move on to the other city destroyed by an atomic bomb in World War II, Nagasaki. It is located on Kyushu Island, and in order to reach it, 250 miles southwest of Hiroshima, our Shinkansen train crossed Kaman Strait through an 11.7 mile, let me get that back, tunnel to Hakata, where we had to change to the 3-foot 6-inch gauge network. In all, it took us a little over 3 hours to make the trip. If I had designed this sculpture, I would have had the benches facing the streetcar tracks. Nagasaki, a major port on the East China Sea, has a compact standard gauge streetcar system of 4 routes, with one operating on private right-of-way to the northern suburbs. At Akasako, with a population of about 450,000, it is about a third the size of Hiroshima, and its 7 miles of route is rightfully also a third of Hiroshima's network. The railroad station is right down here. Car 1701 is shown at the station serving the city's Peace Park, which commemorates the results of the plutonium bomb dropped on August 9th, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima's uranium bomb. Here are a few photos of the grounds of the memorial. The cherry blossoms had followed us from Honshu to Kyushu Island. The museum is smaller and more compact than the one at Hiroshima, which makes it more intimate, especially when listening to the stories of the survivors in audio and video presentation. That's Claire standing under the cherry tree. It makes one think of how the lives of normal, everyday people were destroyed in an instant by the blast, although one has to balance that with knowledge of the crimes their leaders brought to the world. Let's start with a review of Nagasaki's rolling stock. Like most other streetcar systems, Nagasaki did not make wholesale purchases of equipment, but bought replacements to worn out cars when needed. So there was a wide variety of models. Working from the oldest cars in service to the newest, we can chart the evolution of the company's rolling stock. All cars are double-ended. Number 209 represents a series of 16 cars built by Nippon Sharyo and Hitachi in 1950. The body design evokes US practice from 25 to 30 years earlier. Like all the cars we're going to see, they're peppy with plenty of verve. Another view of 209, which you can see has front and rear doors. Fare collection is pay as you leave. Number 307 from 1953, looking much the same. Number 377 in advertising paint was built by Nippon Sharyo in 1962. It represents the introduction of the Peter Witt design with front and center doors rather than front and rear doors. The 502 came from a car builder called Nanina Koki in 1966. But except for the center doors, the body looks similar to the 200 series built in 1950. Number 509 is shown with number 1303. This slide transitions us to the introduction of a more modern design of streetcar. Number 1301 of the same series of 5 cars were built locally by Nagasaki Urakami in 1975. These are described as Kauki style units, which seem to be descriptive of having new style bodies, a term that was also used for automobiles and translates, I think, to radiant, bright, splendor, and so on. To me, it represents the introduction of boxy bodies, which I've never considered attractive, like the Kawasaki cars in Philadelphia. Note the center poles on the street in this photo. Number 1502, also in the Kauki style, and also from Nagasaki Urakami in the late 1970s. The tan end of number 1502.።。 Number 1701 from Nagasaki Urakami in 1999. Number 1802 in the same style and from the same builder, but in the year 2000, showing that the style remained in favor for at least 25 years. Number 1801 in a bright color scheme, leaving the railroad station. Newer car 2001 in the same location, but approaching it. It was built by Alna as part of a project to create a Japanese standard LRV. It must have been just as successful as the Boeing project in the US, as the car and its partner number 2002 are no longer in service. Number 3002, one of three 3000 series modern low floor articulated light rail vehicles, was built by Alna Sharyo, formerly Alna Kauki, for Nagasaki in 2004. This was my first exposure to Alna's line of Little Dancer LRVs, a competitor of Nagata's in supplying smaller streetcar systems with modern rolling stock. I'd see many more Little Dancers in other cities on Kyushu and Shikoku Islands later in the trip. Here the car approaches the railroad station. Apparently the name Little Dancer reflects the dancing image of the cars and the fact that they are little, at least in the mind of the car builder and its website. Another view of 3002. Interestingly, the timetables posted at car stops indicate which trips are accessible, served by these low-floor cars, a practice on many legacy systems worldwide when they introduced low-floor cars to the public. Just after our visit, Nagasaki received two more low-floor Little Dancers from Alna, number 5001 and 5002 in 2011 and 2012. This view is from Yuri's transphoto.ru site. We complete our review of Nagasaki's rolling stock with car 168, a 1911 Kawasaki deck roof unit at the company's shop. Phil and I visited the facility and the folks kindly let us into the yard to photograph the car, which was at the front of one of the barn tracks. The wooden bodied unit with grill trucks actually was built for Fukuoka and obtained by Nagasaki in 1957. Much better than a replica, it was restored for Nagasaki's anniversary in 1985. I really love the city of Nagasaki and its streetcar system, especially as we have some of the best food and lodging that we encountered on the whole of Japan. Just bear with me as I show more slides of this nifty operation. Number 202 is shown parallel and below the JR mainline tracks crossing the Origami River at the beginning of a long stretch of private right-of-way alongside the JR used by Route 3 running north to Akasako. The view is from the Ohashi stop just below the car house. Little Dancer 3003 emerging from under a shopping center at the Genbaku Shiryokan stop. Number 366 at the same stop. Here's 1303 in the Sakuramachi district, where the main street containing the tracks of Route 3 tunnels under a large park and the grounds of Nagasaki City Hall. Number 303, about to pass 204, in a scene that evokes the glory days of street railways and vibrant downtowns in the US. Note the mountains in the background at this junction of routes 3, 4, and 5. Number 214 on a bridge over one of Nagasaki's many canals. And Little Dancer 3001 just past that point. Number 213 on the single track, southern portion of Route 5 along another canal. Because of its single track, headways on Route 5 are longer than those on the other three lines. Number 3001 at the same location. Number 1205 is on a pedestrian street. The parked cars must belong to residents or business owners, as the only through traffic permitted consists of streetcars. Note that the center poles contain attractive street lining fixtures. Yes, dual purpose poles can be produced. The first of a few photos near the railroad station shows number 1502 running northward from the busy stop, which contains a pedestrian overpass very much appreciated by photographers, but not necessarily by passengers. This view of number 204 shows the stop's overpass leading to the street and the railroad station. Not very pleasant for passengers, especially those with luggage who have to climb up and down the stairs. We finished Nagasaki with Little Dancer 3002 at the railroad station stop, among the plantings typical of Japanese stations. Our next two destinations were the cities of Kagoshima and Kumamoto on the island of Kyushu, each sporting two streetcar lines. We chose to stay for 2 nights in Kumamoto and make a day trip to Kagoshima rather than keep changing hotels. En route, we rode a JR narrow gauge EMU to Tosu, where we had to change trains. Our second train was a Shinkansen looking express, but that was only the facade of the narrow gauge unit. One of the sights from our train's windows was Tosu's best amenity stadium, where future Hideki Matsui's train or watch trains, or perhaps soccer players do that. The next morning, we rode to Kagoshima and detrained at the Chuo station, one of 2 major railroad facilities in this municipality of 600,000. The very attractive city greeted us here with its iconic Ferris wheel and some attractive statuary. This 1982 monument depicts the 19 young students from the area that defied Japanese overseas travel ban to study in England in 1865 in order to bring back new ideas to what was then an isolated nation. The station's forecourt was ablaze with blooming flowers, and our half-day service of Kagoshima's 8-mile standard gauge 2-route system, we noticed flowers everywhere, with both azaleas and cherry blossoms in bloom. Here, replica car 101 is shown among the flowers with the monument in the background. A photo of the system map posted at stops, but is actually upside down with North and the other major railroad station at the bottom. Here's a better one from the company's website. The city's business district and most of its tourist attractions are up here on the section served by both routes. The Chuo Railroad Station is on Route 2 at left and over here, while the line to the south, to be covered later, and that's over here, is a little bit like an interurban operating on private right of way through an industrialized area in a valley. The line carrying both routes through downtown is lovely, with grass track and center poles. Here, low floor car 7501 approaches the camera with the Ferris wheel. Whoop, this is not that shot. There it is. with the Ferris wheel in the background. This represents Kagoshima's newest acquisitions, one of 4 X model little dancer units delivered by Alna Shario between 2017 and 2019, which I have not yet seen in the flesh. The photo is from Yuri Maller's Transphoto website. Working our way backwards through the roster chronologically, let's take a look at the rest of Kagoshima. Here's a view of number 7002, one of a series of 4 predecessors to the 7500s, a type A little dancer from 2007. Note the elevated pods that contain the operator's position and control, operator's position and controls in the otherwise 100% low floor car. Number 1017 is an early type A little dancer, which is among 9 that came between 2001 and 2005. Note how the center poles along the beautifully manicured section of center of the road reservation in the heart of downtown also contain street lighting fixtures, like in Nagasaki. Most of the system operates on reserved track, albeit a good deal is paved, but separated from motor traffic by white lines or low curbs. High floor number 9702 is also an Alna product and is shown on the flowering principal street in Kagoshima's downtown. The 4-axle car came in 1998. Number 9512 has a very similar look, but it was built in it came in 1995 as a renovation of a unit that started life in 1987 on Osaka's tramway. The abandonments in Kyoto, Gifu, and Osaka certainly were a benefit to the other streetcar operations in Japan, which got plenty of cars from a well-maintained system. Number 2141, also with a Peter Witt style door arrangement, was built by Kyushu Ryokaku in 1994. Downtown New Orleans, take note of the center strip with grass. Even older is number 612, built by Naoya Koki in 1960, during the era that the car builder was also supplying Nagasaki. Number 504 dates back to 1956 and was built by Toya Koki. The three-track streetcar terminal at Kagoshima Ekima, adjacent to the main railway station. And this terminal serves both lines 1 and 2. Here are some additional views from that area in the north end of the city. Number 7001 and 1016 are shown here. Just Little Dancer 7001. Number 1018, Among Flowers and Some Modern Art. Number 504 in the same area. This is the northern junction of routes 1 and 2 at Takamababa, featuring car 1012. Route 2 ends at Korimoto, the southern junction of the 2 lines, where a pedestrian overpass was installed for the benefit of railfan photographers. Car 9502 is shown, as well as a trackage in the foreground, which takes Route 1 south to its terminal at Tamiyama. A view from the overpass showing just a single trailing point switch to serve the needs of Route 2. And that's the terminal of Route 2. As a result, it's very congested here, and we saw more than one Route 2 car take the switch 3 times to get out of the way of Route 1 cars coming in both directions before its scheduled departure. And you can see that right here. Route 2 car would come in, lay over here. If another car came this way, it would have to take the switch. Then another car would come this way, so it would have to go back, and then before it take the switch again before it headed out. Don't forget it's left-hand operation. This is where a video would be more interesting than my cursor. From the surface at this point, cars 21, 21, and 22 pass each other. Car 9702 operating near the northern end of the private right-of-way through the industrial area that lies in the southern part of the city and is covered by Route 1. Number 2132, further along through the valley with the parallel JR line on the embankment above. Number 1015, waiting for departure time at the covered Taneyama terminal next to a suburban station on the JR line. It took us only a half day to ride and photograph this small system. So while Phil and Sue spent the afternoon at museum, Claire and I rode a ferry across the harbor to the island of Sakurajima in the South China Sea. Sakurajima is home to an active volcano, and we saw it erupt during our 15-minute boat ride. A plume of smoke, volcanic ash, emerged from the mountain, evolving into a dark cloud above its peak. Unfortunately, regular clouds got in the way of the photo, but apparently the volcano erupts about 200 times a year. A sightseeing bus met the ferry, which operates every 15 minutes, and we were off on a tour of the island with narrative in both English and Japanese. We made some stops and were able to hike through the lava fields where we were afforded some excellent views like this one. There is a large visitor center and observatory at the Rose Summit, and we stopped there for refreshments and to look at a small museum. We hit it off with an attractive Japanese young lady who spoke English and her father, who were visiting this Kyushu outpost on a short vacation from work. It was a very pleasant diversion from our railfan activities. Next on our list was a day in Kumamoto, where we spent the previous 2 nights. When traveling from Nagasaki, we inadvertently got off at the Kami Kumamoto station instead of the main one, following most of the passengers. And so to get to our hotel, we had to ride a Route 3 car instead of a 2. It was no big deal. The city has a population of 670,000, just about the same as Kagoshima's, and also sports an 8-mile-long 2-line standard gauge streetcar system. The lines in Kumamoto overlap for most of their length, splitting at the system's western end, with Route 2 operating south to the main station and Route 3 hitting the JR some 2 miles further northward at Kami Kumamoto, as per the last slide. And I think we're missing something. We're missing a map. Okay, sorry about that. In fact, well, I'm just going to go on. This photo of car 1091 is typical of the city's streetcar operation, which is mostly in pavement in the center of streets, separated from motor traffic by white lines. As you will see, the rolling stock is quite similar to Kagoshima's, with both cities having a great deal in common, including the previously mentioned population, number of streetcar lines, route length, and even scrape-off day passes. In fact, it is virtually identical in the age of the cars and their manufacturer until the advent of modern low-floor cars. The traditional looking Toyohashi built 1092, shown in a pleasant advertising color, dates from the mid-1950s. They have conventional controllers and brake handles and are also equipped with wooden floor. Now to a more modern era. The 8200s were built in 1982 by Nippon Sharyo. The second photo of the two-car series downtown was taken from a pedestrian overpass. The 8500 series arrived from Alna in 1985. And the 9200s from the same car builder came 7 years later in 1992. The 9700s are Kumamoto's first low-floor articulated cars. In fact, the first 100% low-floor units to have been built for any Japanese property. They were modeled on the groundbreaking MAN Adtrans German design that was first introduced in Augsburg, Munich, and Bremen. The 5 cars of this series were built by Nagata under an Adtrans, now Bombardier, now Alstom license. This is a departure from the correspondence with Kagoshima, as their low-floor cars are from Alna. The 0800 series of low-floor cars, which look like the LRVs running in many US cities, like Minneapolis, were also built by Nagata using Bombardier technology. They're very similar to what we saw earlier on our trip in Toyama and Takaoka. The Deck Roof 101 is Kumamoto's entry into the nostalgia race, built by Alna with modern controls in 1993. One of the most alluring places to photograph a tramway is from the Tori Chaosuji Suidocho stop in view of Kumamoto Castle. The landmark was reconstructed into its present form in 1960, but dates back to the period from 1467 to 1610. Cars 1355 and 9703 are shown here. Here are a few more slides from this vantage points. First, a close-up of 1355, built by Toyohashi in 1960. And now, 2 showing the 2 classes of Nagata-built low-floor cars, number 9704 and 0802. The alighting passengers seem to be patiently waiting for both tram and auto traffic to pass before crossing the street. Another photo, but without passengers. A short stretch of Route 3 operates over back alley right-of-way, where the line moves from one street to another, very reminiscent to me of the old North Shore line between 5th and 6th Streets in Milwaukee. Here are modern 0801, followed by replica 101. There's the map. And what I wanted to say about the map is that, well, here's where we arrived at Kami Kumamoto. We should have continued to the main Kumamoto station. So we ended up riding line 3 down to our hotel in this area instead of line 2. But notice on the map, and this is a Robert Strondel map, line 3 is now line B, and line 2 is now line A. At some point, they renumbered the routes. I guess in the old days, there must have been a Route 1. When we had first arrived in Kamikomamoto, we saw another terminal across the street. And after checking this map, we rode back to investigate, which ended up in the desire from some more riding. And this blue line is the other thing that we observed on the map. First, we photographed car 1204 after leaving the streetcar terminal. It's the Toyohashi traditional unit built in 1958. Note the JR tracks behind the car. The map shows our route over the Kumamoto Electric Railway. Back to the map. And we traveled on a shuttle train, the one that you saw in the picture, up to Kita Kumamoto, and then continued back into downtown. Upon our arrival at Kita Kumamoto, we serendipitously found the company's car house and shop. And as we began wandering about, we were pleased to see 2 museum cars undergoing restoration and 2 folks inspecting the older unit, number 71. It turned out that a company employee was showing a Japanese rail fan with a camera and showing the cars to him. And as a result, we were allowed to board it too, and were able to inspect its wooden interior. I don't know the history of the car since neither of the 2 gentlemen spoke English, so I don't even know how old it is. Here's a view of the 2 cars together, followed by a head-on shot. Oops. Oh, there is the head-on shot. Phil walked around the car and said that the other side of the double ender had the number 17 instead of 71, but I'm sure that's now been corrected. Number 5102 was built by Tokyo in 1954 for its Tokyo interurban operations. All were replaced by newer units by 1986, and many were sold to other operators, like this one, in 1981. They ran in regular service here in Kumamoto at least until 2006. And I found that out from a photo on the internet. A lineup of KER equipment from the company's internet site. So you can see some of the different cars that once ran in service. Here are 2 cars of the 6000 series in the yard. They were built by Kawasaki in 1968 for the Tokyo subway and were sold to the KER in 1999. A close-up of the 6118. The 6218 leads a 2-car train heading from Miyoshi to downtown Kumamoto, which we boarded and rode. We eventually rode Route 2 to the main railway station and photographed number 8503 and 9705 at the stub-end terminal. Actually, there was a great deal of construction going on in preparation for the inauguration of Shinkansen service to Kumamoto. The streetcar line was being extended for 2 more stops, and a new through facility at the railroad station was being built, all now in service. And now we switch to part 4. That afternoon, we returned to the northern part of the island and stayed in Kokura, part of Kitakyushu Prefecture, which has a population of about 1.5 million, making it the second largest after Nagasaki on Kyushu. It was originally going to be the target of the plutonium bomb, but because smoke and clouds were above the city on August 9th, 1945, the delivery aircraft was diverted to Nagasaki. We were only going to spend half of the next day here as a streetcar line. Actually, a light rail interurban is relatively short, and we had to go to Okayama, which would become our headquarters for the rest of the trip. Kokura itself has a monorail line, and the area around its inner terminal at the JR station was easy to photograph. The line is 5.5 miles long with 13 stations and entered service in 1985. We did not ride it. Another scene from the Kokura area near the railroad station. The remaining electric traction operation, called the Chikuho line, operates north to south in the western suburbs. Its streetcar connection to town was abandoned to buses in 1992, the last of a large network of standard and narrow gauge lines that serve Fukuoka and Kitakyushu. This is sort of opposite the experience in the US, where interurbans that ran over city streetcar networks were abandoned before urban routes. While there was a bus over its former 8-mile long route to its new inner terminal at Kurosaki, it is much faster to ride a JR suburban train from Kokura, as it takes only 20 minutes. Here is an older 3-section 2000 series articulated car on the electric railway. The standard gauge line is 10 miles long and has 21 stops and runs from Kurosaki to Nagata. Unlike most Japanese interurbans, it was never upgraded with high-level platform and station fare collection, so it is now considered a light rail line. 2 more views of the 2000s on this rural line. Here's a photo of number 2006 behind the Chikuho's car house and shop in Nakama at about the midsection of the route. Note the name of the current owner. The newer cars in the 3000 series are smaller, only double units, and date from the late 1980s. 2-man crews are utilized with tickets purchased from onboard machines, exact change only because of change machines, and checked by roving conductors. Zone checks, plastic or paper, indicating where passengers board, are issued by machines located on station platforms. Base headways are every 12 minutes, but in rush hours, this is augmented to a frequency of every 6 minutes on the inner half of the line, which is more suburban than rural, at least as far as Nakama. The trains operate at decent speeds, connecting the underground terminal in Kurosaki and the elevated platform at Nagoda in 33 minutes, despite stopping at 20 way stations en route. We enjoyed riding and photographing the Chikuho very much. It's quite a nice operation with lots of curves, grade crossings, hills, and bridges. And there was a long trestle over the Anga River near the outer terminal. We did not have the time to walk back to that bridge for photos, as we had only allocated a half day to cover the line. Four more articulated cars have been added to the roster since our visit. A photo from the Transphoto website shows the first of these little dancer units manufactured by Alna Shario. After a quick train ride, We reached Okayama, a city with a population of 700,000. After checking into our hotel, Phil immediately went back to Hiroshima because he liked the system so much and wanted to take additional video footage, while I spent the afternoon riding and photographing the 3-mile-long, 3-foot 6-inch gauge streetcar system, the smallest in all of Japan. The stub-end streetcar terminal at the railroad station serves both of Okayama's routes and consists of a center platform serving a pair of tracks for picking up passengers just beyond a double crossover, and a second platform for discharging passengers, which you can see in this photo. The lines are not particularly interesting, with the tracks running in the center of the street, generally separated from motor traffic. Route 2, the shorter of the two lines, follows Route 1 along a relatively wide boulevard for a short distance before turning off. Service on this line is not very frequent, but cars on Route 1 were running at an adequate 10-minute headway. The map comes from urbanrail.net. There are pedestrian overpasses at the ends of both lines, which afford a good opportunity to get photos without autos in the way, or not, in this view of car 7901. Both lines are double track, but Route 2 has a single track stub-end terminal. Almost all of the rolling stock is traditional, built between 1980 and 1993, although there are now a few, 3 specifically, newer low-floor articulators. The bodies are equipped with prominent and colorful but garish advertising. Like the cars of most other Japanese systems, they are double-sided and double-ended. But of all the cities in Japan we visited, only in Okayama did we notice the use of right side doors and center platforms. As a result, passengers pay their fares upon entering. The first 2 digits of the car's numbers indicate their year of their acquisition, but only if you add 1910 to them. Thus, number 70101 was acquired from Akita in 1982 and 7201 from Oida a year later. Both were actually built by Alna in 1959 and 1956, respectively. A 3/4 view of the 7201. Number 7601 was actually purchased new in 1986 from Alna. Number 8301 came in 1993 from the city of Nikko after being rebuilt by Alna. It was constructed in the 1950s by Utsunomiya Sharyo, a company that later changed its name to Subaru. Oddly enough, the city, Utsunomiya, about 65 miles north of Tokyo, is in the process of building a new 3-foot 6-inch gauge light rail line, which is supposed to open this year. Oddly enough, the 9-mile-long undertaking will serve a Honda research and development facility. A telephoto view of number 8301 with 7202 at the outer terminal of Route 1, Higashiyama. Note the stairway leading up to a park in the background. The appearance of LRV 9201 at Higashiyama was a great surprise to me, as prior to the afternoon school rush period, I didn't know that Okayama had any modern cars. Built in 2002 and nicknamed Momo after the hero of a Japanese fairy tale, this 6-axle unit was the first of Nagata's 100% low-floor articulators. Momo and car 7401 wait for time on the tail tracks just beyond the outer terminal of Route 1. A close-up view of the 9201 showing the trackage turning to the right and leading to the Okaden Museum, a combination art and railway tramway institution directed towards children. What cannot be seen here, hidden by the 9201, is a track running to the left, which is used by pull-ins and pull-outs for access to the company's yards and shops. That goes this way, while the track to the museum goes that way. And the track to the museum is probably only used by charters bringing children to that spot. Momo at the inner terminal across the street from the JR station. I found the interior of the unit quite interesting, as it is equipped with a wood inlay floor ramping up to the center of the car from the doors and operator's position. Its 2 and 2 transverse seating is more like 1.5 and 1.5, and there are some wooden longitudinal ledges near the articulation for riders to rest their butts. Passengers wanting to sit down must step up onto a pedestal to reach the seats, as wheel wells and other equipment are located directly above the floor. The pair of fare boxers at each end are mounted quite high, and the contact point for those wanting to tap smart cars is at the top. This means that many school children, which constitute a great deal of the ridership after 1500, have to stand on their tippy toes to pay their fares. To avoid being dropped or lost, their smart cars are generally attached to their book bags or backpacks by spiral telephone cords. And with the seats rather high above the car's center aisle, many of the all well-behaved students' feet do not touch the floor when they're seated. It was a rather strange sight to see all of those dangling legs. This is the opposite of ergonomic design. While on the plus side, for the small kids, the transverse seats work out to be 2 and 2. A year after my visit, Okayama received a second low-floor articulated car from Nagata, number 1011, called Momo 2. This photo is from Yuri Maller's transphoto.ru site. Okayama would be our home for the next and last 3 nights in Japan, as it is the railhead for rail travel to the island of Shikoku, home of 2 cities with streetcar operation, and day trips from this point would eliminate the need for moving our luggage and finding hotels in those places. Phil and Sue returned to the US 2 days before us, and we said goodbye to them when they left for Narita airport after breakfast. It dawned cloudy, and Claire decided to stay in Okayama for sightseeing while I would travel to Kochi, home of Japan's second largest streetcar system after Hiroshima's. This was the view from our hotel room during the previous afternoon when the sun was shining. Access to the island by rail involves traveling through a series of tunnels and then over the double-deck Seto Ohashi bridges, an 8-mile-long causeway over the inland sea. The double-track railway is on the lower level. The sky got darker and darker, and then it began to rain as my DMU left electrified territory. The rain was substantial as I departed the railroad station and found the streetcar terminal. Fortunately, the terminal is protected from the elements, but I knew I would have to get wet when doing some photography, but I didn't realize how wet. Number 604 and 1002 contrast the old and somewhat new from Kochi's roster. Number 210, a Hitachi product from 1952, approaches the terminal. The Pacific Ocean port of Kochi is located north of Tosa Bay, and its downtown is defined by several rivers that flow into the harbor. And you can see the 2 rivers on the map here. Tosa is the historic name for the area, and the 3-foot 6-inch gauge rail system is operated by the privately owned Tosa Electric Railway, known as the Tosaden. Two unnumbered lines operate in the city of 350,000 and cross at almost a Grand Union in the heart of downtown. The shorter one, about 2 miles in length, runs south from the station on double track in the center of an arterial street to an area sporting a high school and chemical plant. The other line is very long, running east-west for a distance of about 14 miles. Very long for Japan. Its entire reach is not shown on this map. There is some service between the railroad station and the east-west line, but predominantly, and this would be the curve that it would take, predominantly the lines cross at Haramaya Bashi. I limited my photography at first in the hope that the weather would improve, but hour by hour it got worse, with the rain becoming heavier and heavier. It was extremely fortunate that almost all the car stops are equipped with shelters. Another view at this almost Grand Union showing a rare move from the railway station line to run westward. I rode car 609 over the long line to Ino, which changes from double track to single as the territory gets more rural. Go back to the, okay. Because of this, the frequent headways get reduced at several short-term terminals, and through cars are relatively scarce. The operator of the car knew what I wanted to do and let me get off and photograph it while we were waiting for opposite numbers at several points on the single track operation. What is a 4 or 5 minute headway in the city center doubles here, and after the line crosses the Kagami River, the track soon moves to private right-of-way at the side of the road with occasional forays onto the street. After a few more sidings, we reach the village of Asakura, where every second car is turned again. There is no roadside reservation beyond this point, so in order to assure blocks are clear, operators exchange batons and then again at the remaining passing siding at Yashiro Dori in the middle of nowhere. The batons, actually hoops, for each of the two sections are painted yellow and red respectively, and the headway is every 21 minutes along the final stretch. It's a quaint operation, almost a rural tramway attached to a city system, and it certainly begs for further exploration and photography on a nicer day. This is the end of the line in Ino. It was nasty and wet. Note that the 600 series from 1957 and built by the Tosaden has a Peter Witt style door arrangement. Back at Haramaya Bashi, we take a look at Kochi's roster, starting with the 200 series cars built by Hitachi in 1952, which just have only front and rear doors. Cars 1001 and 1002 were rebuilt in the company shops with a more modern body than the older units, possibly in the 1990s. The trend continued on into the year 2002 with cars 2001 to 2003 rebuilt in a similar manner from higher number 200 series units originally built in 1955. The earlier 200s just had front and rear doors, and these have front and center ones. Note the uncovered pedestrian overpass in the background. Had it not been pouring, I would have been able to take some photos of cars operating from these structures in view of the almost Grand Union, but that would have been foolhardy on this day. Oddly enough, on the few occasions When I ventured out from under the canopies at stops, ladies with umbrellas attempted to hold them over my head. Lastly, we see an outlier, low floor car 101, a little dancer built by Alna in 2002. I think it is accurate to say that except for this car, which is called the Heart Tram, all of Kochi's rolling stock is traditional, a good reason to visit the property. Another good reason, which unfortunately was not manifested because of the pouring rain, was to see the operation of equipment in Tosaden's fleet of international cars, which were all regauged in the company shops. This includes a Goldfish from Oslo and cars from Lisbon and Graz as well. Other cars that have operated in Kochi include ones from Vienna, Milan, Prague, and Stuttgart. Since 2014, Stuttgart GT4 735 runs in tourist and charter service in Fukui. This 2017 photo by Andre Knorr is from the Trans photo site. I know Andre, he lives in Switzerland. There is also a replica of a deck-roofed car from 1905 in Kochi, which was built in 1984. This comes from the company's website. Now we'll follow the eastern part of the main trunk line to Komenmachi, trying to stay out of the rain, but not always succeeding. Number 629, from the shelter of a shelter. Number 605, coming off the Kokubo River Bridge en route to Gomenmachi. Further east along the line, Little Dancer 101 is shown heading towards downtown. Two more modern cars were delivered since my visit. Little Dancer 3001 from Alna in 2018 and 3002 just recently. Don't have pictures of those. Couldn't find them. A second view of the Little Dancer at Kako Station. Car 607 in an advertising livery at the Gomenmachi terminal, the only example of single track on the eastern end of the line, actually a long tail track. The weather made it impossible for me to photograph other interesting parts of the operation, particularly on this line, where for the most part, the double track runs on what best could be described as the shoulder of the main road. Because of the narrow right-of-way, outbound trams operate very close to inbound traffic, and at some stops, passengers literally are dropped off onto the highway. Because of similar tight clearances on the in-village street portions of the single track on the inner end of the route, automobiles often have to pull over to the wrong side of the road to yield to oncoming streetcars. This concludes Kochi. On the next day, our last in Japan, we traveled across the same bridge and over the part of the same rail route to Matsuyama, but under wire and in sunny weather, totally opposite from the previous day in Kochi. Matsuyama is the largest city on Shikoku with a population of 500,000. The map from Robert Schwandel indicates that Matsuyama has a rather compact tram system, 5 lines, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, covering 6 route miles. Much of its trackage is in streets, separated from motor traffic by lane markings. There is some single track shown with thinner lines, mostly on a stretch of very interesting back alley private right-of-way, which is quite narrow in places. This is the only reserved track on the system except the terminals. Service was intensive on routes 3 and 5, with headways running about every 4 to 6 minutes. Routes 1 and 2 are circular loop lines with headways running with a sub-terminal shared with the 3. The number 1 runs clockwise and the 2 counterclockwise. Except for the parts that overlap other routes, the 1 and 2 run on single track along the PRW. The two strategically passing sidings permit a 10-minute headway on both directions. Route 6 operates over the system's remaining single track, which is located in pavement with no passing sidings. As that section is quite lengthy, the frequency of Route 6 is no better than every 30 minutes. As you will see, I saved the best for last, like icing on a cake, both in preparing our trip's itinerary and showing it tonight. Our first view of the streetcar system, called the Shinai-sen by the locals, was right outside the railroad station. Route 5 turns back here, while the 1 and 2 run through. The 200 series consists of 5 cars that came from Kyoto in 1979, but had been constructed in 1965. Not much different are the traditional cars that sport 2-digit numbers. They were built for Matsuyama in the years from 1951 to 1965 and also have lasted a long time. Here are 2 passing at the stop, serving the railroad station. Also at the same place, here is car 2106, part of a series of 4-axle versions of the Little Dancer, built by Alna from 2002 to 2007. These 10 were the first 100% low-floor cars built in Japan. The same car heads onto the single track north of the station, about to make a counterclockwise loop of the system. We waited at this stop for a good reason. And this is the pièce de résistance, the bochan. A timetable posted at the station told us when it was coming. There's a train made up of a replica steam engine pulling 1 or 2 coaches. These locomotives are powered by diesel fuel, although ersatz steam is occasionally emitted from the stack. Here's a closer up view. Again, this is right outside the main railroad station. Interestingly, although it's hard to see on most photos, the coaches are equipped with a ladder-style pantograph, just like those on the streetcars. I observed one being lifted to the wire prior to the track switches at a junction to allow the desired route to be chosen. This photo comes from Wikipedia. Here are some scenes from the city center with little dancers in the forefront. And these are 4-axle low-floor cars. And here's one with Bochan number 14 at the point of a single car train. I saw 2 different trains running that morning. One of the terminals for the Bochan and routes 3, 5, and 6 is the 1911 built Dogo Onsen station. The streetcars easily reverse here, but it is much more complicated for the steam train. It moves off to a yard area where the locomotive will be first detached from the coaches. Then it is raised on a hydraulic-like turntable embedded between the rails and rotated manually. Back on the rail, it moves forward. After picking up its coaches again, it heads over to a layup area behind the station where the public can examine it and take pictures. And they do. And here's a close-up of the builder's plate on the replica locomotive. A bilingual plaque, only the English is shown here, provides a general history of this iconic operation. As far as I could tell, it got the name Bochan from a very popular 1906 novel where the central character rides these trains into Matsuyama each day to go to work as a teacher. The railway lines were originally 2-foot 6-inch in gauge, and the locomotives were imported from Krauss in Munich in 1891. The gauge of the system's route were widened to 3-foot 6-inch between 1931 and 1937, and electrification came line by line from 1931 to 1967, with steam operation finally discontinued in 1958. In 2001, the diesel-powered replicas made their appearance for historic and touristic purposes. One of the original trains is preserved. Then when departure time approaches, the train is wide around to the station. It's fun to see the two side by side. The inbound car is air conditioned, as all streetcars are, but one cannot say that for the old-fashioned coaches. The Bachan's other terminal is usually Matsuyama-machi, the southern end of routes 1, 2, and 3, and near the principal interurban station. This track map from the urbanrail.net site shows the Uetsu interurban lines, which are under the same management as the streetcar system. You can see that both operations, whoops, how did that happen? You can see that both operations share the same shop area. The single track here is the streetcar, and the double track is the interurban. And the interurban ends right near where the steam train was shown in the previous photo. And they cross each other at grade at this point. After we look at the interurban, we will follow the single track used by the 1 and 2 lines. First, here is a photo around the congested shop area where they possibly share some track. The location is on the interurban's Takahama line, where it intersects the single track of routes 1 and 2. This line remains electrified at 600 volts DC, the same as the tramway, while the other interurban routes operate at 750 volts. It was too difficult to photograph here without trespassing onto the interurban's right-of-way. But more interesting is the on-street crossing. Interurban service on the Takahama line operates at a 15-minute headway, so photographers don't have to wait too long for an EMU train to come. And with the crossing gate stopping traffic every 7.5 minutes, a meet is not at all unusual. Here's another view I took. Reminds me of a place right outside of Dresden, where a steam railroad line crosses the Dresden streetcar system. At the same crossing, the transit company's vintage tourist service bus comes by. Now, my best view is along the single track circular line, which is actually quite pretty, even though it traverses a great deal of narrow back alley right-of-way. Car 68 passes some roses as it approaches the station. Confining is hardly the word for much of the traffic, the trackage. Several platforms for clockwise and counterclockwise cars, necessary because of the Peter Witt style door arrangement, are squeezed in. Another view of a car on the narrow right-of-way. And a second, crossing gates are used to prevent collisions and to avoid having to flag. The newer low-floor cars are also assigned to routes 1 and 2. Number 2101 approaches one of the passing sidings, where it passes number 2003. Two more photos with cherry blossoms, which were at their peak during our visit to Matsuyama. After covering the Bachan and the streetcars to my heart's content, there was still time to get to get in a little sightseeing. This map shows the city's principal tourist attraction right here in the center. The 17th century Matsuyama Castle at the summit of the 435-foot high Mount Katsuyama in the geographical center of town. The common way to access the apex is to ride the ropeway in one of its two counterbalanced gondolas. And you can see that's illustrated right here. However, this system does not have the capacity to carry the large crowds on a nice day. So there is also a triple chairlift that climbs to the summit alongside. The ride on either mode costs about $5 each way, with the cable line being faster, but it also can have lines with a long wait for access. We sampled both. The gondola is at left and the chairs are on the right. This view from the top places the competing systems on the other side of each other. A three-quarter view of one of the two cable cars. And the second panoramic view from the summit of the city and surrounding its surrounding mountains, illustrating the area's allure and beauty. For completeness, we conclude our visit to Matsuyama with two views of Route 6. The second along its single track. And there's that one. And as I mentioned before, a 30-minute headway because there are no passing sightings. And lastly, a photo from Wikipedia of one of the 8 Little Dancer articulated cars obtained from Alna by the Shinai-san since my visit. The articulated cars are numbered 5001 to 5008. After returning to Okayama and spending the night, we rode the Shinkansen back to Tokyo and continued on to Narita Airport. We almost didn't make it in time for the flight because of a suicide on the high-speed railway. But all's well that ends well, just like tonight's program. Thank you very much.
Jack, thank you so much. This was just a wonderful program. Before I ask everyone to unmute, Phil Burton had asked a question, is how are you able to organize such a trip to a country where English is not the primary language? What were your sources?
Well, for me, the literature is all in English. It's only the people that mostly do not speak English. So it was absolutely not a problem. This was 2010, really before much of the internet was available. And there were offices of Japanese railways in the New York City area, specifically in New Jersey and Paramus. And I used those to help along with the Japan rail passes.
Okay, well, that's wonderful. And is Schwandel now has a book on Japan? That's another source?
3-volume set. And I should mention that Ray DeGroot and some others wrote a predecessor 3-volume set about the railways and interurbans of Japan, which I read before taking the trip.
Okay, that's wonderful. Do you have a few minutes before we shut the meeting down? If people want to congratulate Jack or have any questions?
Great show, Jack. You had mentioned a couple websites. Could you review those again?
1 second.
Great
I
show,
just
Jack.
want to make sure I'm not muted. Okay.
I'm leaving. them.
Oh, Japanese JR has websites. Robert Schwandel has a website. You know, all you have to do is Google Japan tourism, and boy, you see a heck of a lot of stuff.
See this?
I can't give you the names right off my fingertips right now.
You had mentioned Yuri, someone.
Yuri Mahler, he's an ERA member, lives, I think works for the Transit Authority
Yes,
and lives out in Brooklyn.
right.
And he and his cohorts, mostly from Russia, have created a wonderful site of tramways around the whole world. And they're great for research.
Leroy Demery has done several very good books on Japan with maps and specifics and detail. Leroy Demery.
Yeah, I think his books may be a little out of date now. I have them. Hi, it's Andrew. I went to Japan in 2017, 1 year after the ERA did its, they did a group trip, and a lot of that information about what to see came from Jack, from the late Ron Yee, and I just arranged, again, just like Jack did, arranged myself, got the rail pass, went from town to town. Really no problems at all, even though there's still limited English, but no difficulties getting around at all.
Hey, Jack, great show. Gordon Thompson would be very proud of you. The late Gordon
I
Thompson.
should have mentioned Gordon Thompson the first time, and he wrote a series of monographs on all the interurban lines in Japan, and I used that also as reference.
He also contributed to the report in TRB on the shared track. He did the whole eastern rim, the Pacific Rim, and it was a fabulous piece of work. Thank you.
Colin Brown did this book in 2015, which has got a full set of track plans and fleet lists as they were then. That's from the LRTA in England.
Do I dare say that they misspelled the word colorful?
Australian way.
Right.
Hello, Jack. Hello, Jack. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yeah, hi, Jack. This is John Cowan. I'm from Vancouver up in Canada, and I'm a retired conductor with the Canadian Pacific Railway. I'm more of a rail fan than interurban and traction like you guys are, but I got to say your presentation was totally fascinating. I even had my dinner in the den tonight with my wife. I vacated my wife to stick with your show. It was amazing. I do volunteer on an old BC Electric interurban car out here in Vancouver, and I rode and drove a train on the Hershey Electric Railway in Cuba. That being said, I do want to go to Japan. I always have, so I will be in touch with you. 3 people messaged me after I sent a message to get a hold of you, so I do want to pick your brain sometime after today. So I just want to say from Canada, it was a very, very interesting and informative presentation. So thank you, Jack.
I'd be glad to respond to anyone. Bob, you can send my email address to anybody who asks for it.
Very good. I actually put it in the chat, and I also already forwarded to John Cowan, who spoke to you.
Did.
So,
You did.
Hey, Jack. Paul here. How you doing? The show was super.
Oh, hi,
And
Paul.
you must have done an awful lot of research for this. This is really outstanding how much I learned about it, and I've been to Japan. But all the maps, where did you get all those maps?
Well, some of them came from the websites of the transit companies, and a lot of them came from Robert Schwandel's site, Urban Rail Net, urbanrail.net.
Yeah. Do you have any new trips planned or anything coming up?
Well, I'm sort of waiting to see what happens with COVID.
Yeah.
Actually, a week ago, my daughter and her whole family got COVID, even though they were all fully vaccinated. Fortunately, their symptoms were not bad, and now they've been negatively tested on it.
That's good. But again, a great show.
Thanks.
Yes, Jeff McCarthy, may I speak? I can't unmute myself.
yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, great. I just want to reassure everybody, encourage everybody who has questions about going to Japan to just jump on the jet and go. Julie and I and our kids spent 3 years in northern Japan at the American Air Base.
Huh?
In far northern.
No, they're chattering now.
of the main island, Misawa Air Base. And
Go ahead.
we were there when the Seikon Tunnel opened in 87 or 88, so we could ride through the tunnel to Hakodate and ride the trams there. So most people speak English. The Japanese are exceedingly helpful. It's the safest place on the planet. You throw your wallet down on the street, it'll be there a week later.
Yeah.
So just jump on a jet and go.
By the way, I suspect I made a few errors in my descriptions and would be happy to get any corrections.
Now, Jack, I have every picture that you have, only 30 years earlier. That crossing scene in Matsuyama is one of my favorites.
Uh-huh.
I was in Japan in 59, 60, and 61 when I was in the US Navy. 1921. I saw all those streetcars and everything. I was always going to ride them, but I could never get past the bars. So I need to go back now.
Misawa had a charming short interurban line with some ex-Tokyo rail cars that went inland from the about 15 kilometers to a town called Towada, where my son ended up taking English, but it's gone now, I'm afraid.
How do I put up my hand to ask a question?
Go ahead, Russ. Yeah.
Did somebody put up the little sidebar at the bottom asking about the Berlin ERA trip, looking for information? Did I see that just a few minutes ago? No, nobody looking for Berlin?
I posted a link to the 2014 ERA trip detailed planning, which has a lot of information. So it's in the chat.
The Berlin trip that I was on was way before that. Okay. Excuse the interruption.
To Robert, who's chairing the meeting. Robert?
Yes.
If it's appropriate, if I may, it may not be appropriate with this venue, but if it's okay to give a quick plug, I wrote a book about my railroad career at Canadian Pacific last year, and would it be all right if I just give a quick plug to your group?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, I don't know how many of you are rail fans and actually been to Canada, experienced Canadian Pacific and Canadian National, BC Rail, but I was a conductor with CP for 35 years, spent most of my career in British Columbia, working on the famous train, the Canadian, for 10 years. Bud Cars on Vancouver Island, where I met one of your members who's a good friend of mine, Stephen Lofthouse, in 1994. He and his wife were passengers on my train. Anyway, so I wrote a book in 2020 during COVID about my railroad career. It's for sale right now with Morning Sun Books. It's called Trackside Around Canadian Pacific Railway, 1977 to 2012 by conductor John Cowan. It is close to being sold out. So if any of you folks are interested in Canadian railroads, it's definitely a good book to have. And feel free to email me at johnpcowan@shaw.ca, or I'm on Facebook. John Cowan. Thanks. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it.
Sure. Feel free to put it in the chat.
Live right here in New Jersey, and I know them quite well. And my wife and I, Claire, rode the Canadian on 2 occasions across Canada. Maybe you were the conductor on one of them. We also rode the Dominion.
Wow. Well, I didn't work back. Well, I worked on CP Canadian out of Revelstoke in 1978. Then I transferred to Vancouver. And then I worked Via's Canadian out of Vancouver, from Vancouver to Kamloops for 10 years. I was a CP employee, but I worked on Via's Canadian until, I don't know, you guys probably know our government cut Via in half in 1990. It was a horrendous thing they did, cutting Via in half. They took the Canadian off the CP route, but I did get to work it for those years. So if you rode the train out of Vancouver on the CP route in the 80s, I could very well have been your conductor. Yep.
No, we did it a little before then.
But I did work with an old-time conductor who hired on in 1939. He retired in 1983, and he worked on the Dominion and the Mountaineer and the Kettle Valley train. So yeah, so I worked with a lot of old-timers. So anyway, so.
Canadian Pacific is very scenic, and I guess in passenger service, you can only ride it, I guess, after COVID on the Rocky Mountaineer, which does run through the spiral tunnels on its route from Calgary to Vancouver.
Well, yeah, you're right. And that
ride, and some of us ERA people did it after our convention in Edmonton and Calgary.
Oh, wow.
We continued on to Vancouver by rail.
You're right. Yeah, the Rocky Mountaineer is the only time you can ride CP.
I don't know if Jürgen and Barbara Senst are on board.
No.
but They were on the same train as I was between Calgary and Vancouver.
Wow, very good.
Some of the peculiarities of the system is here's a wide car on narrow gauge railway and a narrow car on a wide gauge railway. And I'll just run the caption up there for you to see it, Jack. That's and that's what Gordon Thompson produced. And
And that's the Toyohashi Hakone, which I said was dual gauge.
yeah, and it's dual gauge there.
Right.
The
They ripped up
Okiaka.
the third rail, unfortunately.
Yeah, strange. And in the facing page, apparently there was a diesel electric streetcar that operated in Sapporo, I believe. And I'll just kind of show that.
Hey, Jack Murray. Got a question for you. First, a statement, you're still an Iron Man, but am I the only one in the room here who was ever on a Jack-made death march on a 100-degree day?
Oh, don't remind me of that. Although really, now, that was in 1990, and we're now 30 years later. But
You were in Eastern Washington.
have to walk through a rainstorm in Linz, Austria, to get to a tram museum, which is no longer there, but it was then.
Well,
And
I was on the death march.
I directed the group on the wrong road, so we had to walk back and then to the right place.
I love it.
Yeah, it's called the Death March.
Yeah, I gave it to Aaron.
It's not the Baton Memorial Death March, it's the ERA Memorial Death.
Well, it was in where that town is in Washington State. Great program.
Yes.
Great program. Thank you so much, Jack.
I enjoyed doing it.
Now, are you going to do a show of the interurban cars of Kyoto or some of the interurban lines that are so terrific they have there?
Okay. Any other comments or commendations? And
Yeah, just great show, and I hope to see you in 2022, Jack.
Oh, I hope we can get together.
Yeah.
You went?
Okay. Good night, everybody. Good night, Mike.
Good night.
Good night, Bob.
all right, with that, I'm wishing everyone good night, February 18th. Eric Azustowitz, and look forward to seeing all of you February 18th, 7:30. Okay, good night. Have a good weekend.
Night.
Thanks a lot.